Hello everybody, my name is Jim Pingle and welcome to our June 2017 Hangout. This month we're talking about the certificate management on pfSense 2.4 and some other general certificate topics. About this Hangout, this month we have project news. I'll go over just some basics of how certificates work, a little bit about certificate structure security, when you want to use pfSense to manage certificates. Then I'll go over the certificate manager in pfSense and how that works. And then how to deal with certificate authority entries and certificate entries, how a certificate signing request workflow goes, how to use create and use certificate revocation lists, and then how to use certificates throughout the GUI here. All right, first up we have project news. In case you don't know, a 2.4 release is coming next week. It's a very large release, lots of new things. A full list is up on the GUI, or up on the wiki rather, and we'll have a release announcement and everything coming out too. The release images are building now. We're testing them out. We're going to be testing them out over the weekend, putting them through their final set of paces and tests and changes and stuff. Hopefully no more changes, but we'll see. If all goes well, it'll be out early next week. A couple things to note. We did recently add some instructions for upgrading 64-bit NanoBSD to a full install. So if you're running NanoBSD on 2.3, because we don't have NanoBSD on 2.4, if you need to upgrade in place, you can do that, but you can always reinstall. And also, if you're installing from some older hardware that won't boot a MEM stick, we found some workarounds for a couple of older BIOSes that had some issues booting our 2.4 MEM sticks. Those are up on the GUI as well. That's all linked from the page there. Another note, we are taking the packages for 2.2 and earlier offline for security and maintenance issues. Once we get 2.4 out, we usually only support officially the current release and one prior, so that covers 2.4 and 2.3, and the older releases are no longer officially supported. Usually we try to keep the older packages out there as long as feasible, but in this case, because those use a completely different package structure and they haven't been updated in a long time, it was very hard to update those, the PBIs and everything. So they've just kind of fallen by the wayside. Rather than keep those old, vulnerable, buggy packages out there, we've cut those off. We're going to cut those off. Now you can still run 2.2. You can still run 2.1 if you really have to. We don't recommend it. We always recommend running whatever the current release is. But if you have to, you can run it, but you just won't have any packages. It's just in everybody's best interest. We don't want somebody to get compromised because of one of the older packages there. We do have our FRR package, or FR routing is another way to call it. Package is now available for 2.4, 2.3.5, and 2.3.4 users. Had been in testing on 2.4 for a while, but it's fairly stable. It's out there for everybody now in the current versions. That package does BGP, OSPF, OSPF6 all in the GUI, so you don't have to handcraft any configurations. It's all stuff you can click through and do. And that is intended to replace both OpenBGPD and Quagga just in one package, so you can run BGP and OSPF at the same time if you need to. FRR is sort of the successor to Quagga. It forked off from there, and the development's continuing on that. We do have a couple new pieces of hardware that are really cool and coming out. We have our SG3100, which is coming soon. It was formerly known as Rogue One or R1. We've had some blog posts and things about it. It's a very fast ARM device. It's got 6 ports on the back, 4 of which are actually switched Ethernet. So basically you could have 2 WANs and 4 LAN ports. And those, the LAN ports are switched, but there is going to be a capability where you can do like port-based VLANs and lags and stuff with that. And that's all in the works. I think those are going to start shipping sometime in the next few weeks here. We do have also an XG1537. It's going to replace our XG2758 offering. It's an 8-core Xeon D1537. It's got 2 10 gig SFP plus ports and 2 1 gig RJ45 ports. There's a blog post about that one as well. Also, if you have contributed anything to pfSense, that's a little bit easier now. We used to have a requirement for a contributor license agreement, but with the Apache 2 license that we switched to a while back, that's no longer necessary. We've looked over that from a few different angles. So if you can just submit a PR, we can accept it. We don't have to go through any kind of formalities or anything. It's just assumed to be under the Apache 2 license now. All right, so let's talk about some certificate basics. Now, if you're familiar with certificates or X509, ASN1, that kind of stuff, you'll notice I'm leaving quite a bit of stuff out. This is going to be, enough to get you by. Pretty much anything you need to encounter with pfSense or, in that case, even like web servers and other SSL TLS type infrastructure. So certificates provide a framework for public key infrastructure. So you've got a public key and a private key. Private key is always private. Somebody else can use that a public key to encrypt something and send it to you, vice versa. You can also use that to sign and validate data, make sure it came from the correct place, and somebody else can verify that. So you have a certificate that identifies an entity like a firewall or a user, and that certificate has keys for encrypting communications and other purposes. So the identity consists of several values. You have your location information, your city, your state, country, that kind of thing. Organization information like your company name, your maybe even a department name, and it doesn't get down to like a street address or anything typically. You have some other identifying information like host names, email addresses, and IP addresses. You don't necessarily have to have IP addresses on there or email addresses. Most people just stick to host names or usernames. Let's see, and altogether that identifying information forms a certificate subject, and you'll see a subject string like in the GUI and other places. You might have heard of X509 or X.509, and that's the standard that defines the format for the certificates we're talking about. That's the kind of certificates you'll see pretty much anywhere in HTTP, SSL, TLS. It's all X509 stuff. In that standard, it has your identity information and public key and private key. And in the certificate part of it actually has, the public key and the identity information all jumbled together with a bunch of other properties, sort of like, your whole trust, like who signed your certificate and other stuff like that's all rolled in there, along with additional properties and extensions that dictate how you're able to use that certificate. It may say, okay, I'm a client or I'm a server. It might say I'm a certificate authority. It might say you can use this for IPsec, that kind of stuff. So when you have a trust chain made from certificates, intermediates, and root certificate authorities, clients can use that to figure out, if it's okay to encrypt or trust an HTTPS server. You can use it for VPN identification and encryption, or other protocols that use TLS, which pretty much anything encrypted these days is TLS over the internet. Not like everything, obviously, of course, but lots of common stuff. HTTPS, LDAP, SMTP, IMAP, POP3, that kind of stuff. There's all SSL or TLS enabled versions of those. There's also EAP TLS, which you'll see, sometimes you'll see it in concert with either IPsec, like with IPv2 uses EAP, and also you'll see it like 802.1x or like a WPA2 for wireless, that kind of stuff. You'll see certificates around there as well. Looks like somebody's having a video problem. It's okay on my test client. Others are saying it's okay. Unfortunately, there might be something on the client side. If you're in a browser, you might try using a different browser, or if you're in the Fuse app, you might actually try using it in a browser instead of using the app. But sorry about that. Okay, moving along. So the whole process kind of works like this. A client, you have like a client, which could be a web server, could be a firewall, could be a user. That client creates a request with its identity information saying, okay, this is how you know it's me. And it creates, a public and private key pair. Puts the public key together with the identity information and puts it into a certificate signing request. And then it submits that request off to a certificate authority. That request gets signed by a certificate authority in most cases. Sometimes you use the self-signed certificate, like our default GUI cert is self-signed. But that signing process results in a certificate which is delivered back to the client. Typically, you'll have a CA that's got a process to make sure that identity is okay, to validate you are who you say you are, or to trust that the client that certificate is valid. Um, the CA can also be signed by an intermediate CA, or the certificate can be signed by an intermediate CA. So you may have a root, that root trusts an intermediate, and that intermediate trusts you. So if A trusts B, B trusts C, so then if your client trusts that root certificate, it can figure out that it needs to trust everybody else along the way. Uh, so typically you have those root CAs or trust anchors. Those get distributed out to clients somehow. In the case of a self-signed CA or certificate like that's made by you, that may mean you actually sent that to a user to install on their operating system or in their browser. However, in a lot of cases, the default set of trusted public CAs is distributed along with operating systems and browsers internally. So they, by default, these are trustworthy, and then you can go to like Google without actually having to manually verify that the root CA that signed that cert, so on and so forth down the line is okay. Just gives you a nice fuzzy green, nice green check mark and a warm fuzzy feeling. Oh, and there are methods like certificate revocation lists and other methods like OSCP that clients can use to determine if a certificate is still valid. So, a certificate might have been lost or compromised in some way, and a new one had to be made. And so the certificate authority will say, okay, here's this master list of certificates that I have signed before, but are now no good. And so a client will say, okay, well, your certificate's valid against the CA, but it's on the CRL, so I'm not going to trust you. So most commonly, you'll see these certificates associated with SSL TLS and the infrastructure around it. So you've got a CA list in your browser, and that's your trust anchor. Determines who you trust automatically already. You'll have server certificates, and they're identified by key usage and extended key usage properties that will say like, okay, it's okay to be a TLS web server. And the server host name will be in a list of subject alternative names. In the past, they would have been in the common name, but using just the common name to identify a server has been deprecated, and now it has to be in the subject alternative name. Some browsers like Firefox will still fall back and check the CN. Chrome has stopped doing that, and so if you've seen an error with a certificate lately from Chrome, that might be why. But if it works in Firefox but not Chrome with the same certificate, that it could be that kind of a thing. But the subject alternative names is a lot more flexible list because you can give not only host names but email addresses and IP addresses. Generally speaking, in terms of web servers, though, it's just a list of host names that are valid in one certificate. So before a CA signs a request, it's going to validate that in some way. Typically, if you're just going to like Namecheap, GoDaddy, somebody like that, or Rapid SSL, whatever, just buying a cheap web certificate, or even with the free like Let's Encrypt or Acme, it will just have some sort of challenge response automated mechanism where they'll tell you to put this particular string and this particular file and this particular file name on your web server, and they'll make a request and fetch that, or maybe put a record in DNS. Now, in the case of Let's Encrypt the Acme protocol, that's all automated. With others, it might be manual, but that's just for a basic like domain validation. They just basically make sure, yeah, you're saying you own this web server, you need to prove you running this web server in order to, or that you have control of this domain in order to have that certificate. Now, there are extended validations, other levels of validation that might require more research or manual intervention. That varies by validation level and who's doing what. So there are other levels to that. But basically, they need to figure out that you are who you say you are before they'll sign that certificate, letting you be that person or entity. And like I mentioned, the client's going to verify. Your web browser is going to verify with an OSCP or CRL to make sure that certificate is still valid before it actually trusts it and uses it. So when these certificates are passing back and forth, you'll typically see them in just a couple of different formats. Most people are just going to see PEM, but underneath it all is the DIR format, which is a binary format. And PEM is really just it's dir encoded in base 64 with an armor string around it. So this is what you're probably going to see if you've exported or looked at most any certificate out there. You're going to see a begin certificate, an end certificate block or armor string around a block of random looking base 64 encoded data. Private key is going to have a similar looking block with, begin RSA private key and end RSA private key at the beginning and end. Now, when you're working with these, even in pfSense, generally speaking, the armor string has to be maintained. It needs to be you need to have all of the dashes and all of the text before and after the whole block when you're copying and pasting these things into the GUI. So there's also another format that you might see. It's more common with Windows systems, but it's PKCS number 12 or P12. It's a container archive format. You can have multiple certificates and multiple keys in a single file. Typically you'll have the private key certificate and the whole certificate chain all rolled up in a P12 archive. And there's a ton more it can do, but generally speaking, when you encounter one of these, that's what it's going to have in it. And like our OpenVPN client export package can export one of those, and actually the GUI can export a P12 as well, but importing those varies by software and operating system. So because you have private keys involved and you have these certificates that are supposed to securely and positively identify that you are who you say you are, you need to have the structure is very important, and you need to protect this data. So due to the sensitive nature, you need to make sure you're protecting the private keys of the CA over everything, and also any private keys of your certificates. That's obviously at a CA level or operating on the firewall. That's pretty much as secure as you're gonna get in practical use. There's other higher levels than that, but on the other side, on an end user like a mobile user on a laptop or a phone or something like that, there's not a ton you can do there, but you need to take some basic measures. So if your private CA, for a VPN or network, if you're compromised, the attacker could gain access to your network. Now, for a small organization, a data breach is not going to get them that much. If you're a big organization or somebody that deals with a lot of trade secrets or secret info, you have more to lose. So you need to be more secure with how you're dealing with this. Again, a small organization, if your VPN gets compromised in some way, it's relatively easy to make a new CA, a few user certs, and get that back out to everybody. But the larger you are, obviously that's a more sizable task. It's going to be harder to do. So on the other side of that, if a public CA is compromised, which has happened, an attacker could impersonate any web server on the internet. And so, they may have to rush around and put out browser update, whatever, that's get it out to thousands or millions and millions of users, and that's really difficult. If a certificate private key is compromised, an attacker could impersonate just a single server or intercept communications, which is bad, but it could be worse. It's not the entire internet. It's just one web server, which could be range from being annoying on like a personal web server that has really nothing private, or it could be a big company website that's got a lot of secret stuff that nobody should get to, credit card information, who knows what. But you don't want to. You need to be the more important the resources being protected, obviously, the more security you need. So if a client certificate private key, like somebody's laptop, phone, whatever, now if that gets compromised, somebody could get access to the VPN, but if you have multiple factors of authentication, that may not be a huge deal. They could intercept communications in some cases, again, depending on how you're configured. But in that case, it's not that bad. If you set up a CRL, you can revoke that certificate, get the user a new certificate. The impact is fairly low, which is, it's bad but not awful, because you can deal with that relatively easy, especially compared to some of the other scenarios. So how do people deal with this? Well, a number of different ways. Some companies will go crazy with security and they will air gap, keep it offline, anything that manages the CA. Shuffle things back and forth on removable media, and it can be a very, very secure method. It's ideal security. It's really secure, but it's very inconvenient, cumbersome to manage, because you're always having to move stuff back and forth and uh, you can have several levels too. You could have a root CA that's that, and then you have intermediate certificate authorities that may have a little bit less security that are actually doing your day-to-day operations. So for many people, I would probably say the majority, especially of pfSense users, if you're keeping that CA on a secure limited access system like your firewall, it's going to be good enough. It's always a security versus convenience trade-off. So really, it's up to you to decide. But for most people, on the firewall is good enough. It's a limited access system. It's quite secure, but again, it's up to you. So the certificate itself and the public key for the CA, the server, or the client are open information in most cases. Generally speaking, if you're using it for a VPN or something, you may not want to give out that information. It's even if the certificate and the public key are technically public, you don't want to be passing that stuff around. But without the private keys, it's not something they can use except to gain maybe some information about specific identities they may want to target. Private key security is the most important part. So how do you distribute these things if they're so secure? Well, there's a few different ways. Ideally, when you're talking about like a web server, something like that, or in some cases a user, this isn't how you'd mostly do it with pfSense, but unless you're going from one pfSense system to another, you would generate a certificate on the target so that private key never leaves your target system. So you got a web server, you generate your certificate request on that web server, the private key is on the web server there, and it never leaves. So another way is a physical handoff. You could, handle all your certificate work, uh, on a special, dedicated workstation, then, copy it to a USB thumb drive, hopefully something fresh and uncompromised, set it read-only and give it to the user and see how that goes. You have some sort of secure and authenticated communications protocol like SSH or SCP with key-based authentication. I would not recommend distributing keys like this with something like an HTTPS web server or another server that solely relies on a username and password, because you don't want to have all these nice certificates and multiple levels of authentication, all this other stuff, and lock that up behind just a username and password that, if the wrong thing gets compromised or brute forced, whatever, you're done. So you need to have something more secure than that. Like key-based authentication is good, but then you have another problem. Like, how do you get that key in the first place? Well, with SSH, usually you're generating a private key, again on the original client, and they can just hand you a public key and say, "Here's my public key." Another way is smart cards, so things like YubiKeys and similar tokens, where the key is actually stored on the card and can't be extracted. But it's protected by a PIN or a passphrase. So you could give somebody the secure token, and then you could find a secure way to dictate or give them the PIN or passphrase that's easier to pass off. You don't have the same concerns. Like if you're talking about a private key, that's not something you could just read off to somebody or give it to them on a piece of paper that you've written down. It's not something you can do, and then destroy or shred afterwards. But a PIN or a passphrase, yeah, that's something you can do. Now, that's not very useful for something like a web server practically, or in some cases a VPN. It could be in some other cases. We use that method for some things like signing announcements and things like that. We'll have it on a smart token, which is really handy. But that's a little bit different purpose, but it's out there. So with all those security concerns, why would you want to use pfSense to manage them? Well, the firewall is secure enough when properly configured. So on your average network, the firewall is going to be one of your most secure devices. And also, if somebody were to compromise the firewall, they'd pretty much have access to anything they need or could get if they had compromised your certificate structure. So if you're trying to secure a VPN and the VPN terminates at the firewall and they compromise the firewall, they could already sniff the VPN traffic. So it really doesn't help. The security at that point of the CA is moot. So it's always a security versus convenience trade-off, but it's the convenience of it usually outweighs everything in this case. So, it's a limited access system. Few people have access to the firewall. Typically, the firewall's in a physically secure location. It could be in a server room. Maybe it's a locked server room. Maybe it's in a rack. Maybe it's a locked rack. It's not like it's something that somebody is carrying around with them, like in a laptop or in a bag, something like that. So the certificates and keys for server usage, they have to be on the firewall anyhow. So if you're running a VPN or you're doing something like HA proxy, whatever, your private keys are going to be on there anyhow. Um, it's also more convenient than other certificate management solutions. I don't know if you've ever tried using ECRSA like we had to do for OpenVPN back in the 1.2x days, like 1.2.3. That was a giant pain in the rear. Or manually trying to do certificates with OpenSSL, that's also a bit of a nightmare. Now, there are some other management packages out there that might be easier, but it's using the pfSense GUI is terribly convenient. And also, if you've got everything on there, it also lets you do the OpenVPN client export package, which is a huge benefit, especially for OpenVPN, for like Windows clients and things, getting the configurations out there. So that's a big win. So why wouldn't you want to use the firewall? Well, it's still connected to the network. Uh, it could theoretically be compromised by a remote attacker, and thus the security of it could be compromised. So again, depending on what you're doing, it may or may not matter. Right now, we don't have any means of automating the certificate generation process for large batch operations. So if you need to have, like, say, 100 VPN users, and you've got them like in Active Directory or Radius or something, and you want to do the certificates on the firewall, well, it's kind of tricky. There's no good way to automate that. You could have to custom script something at the moment. We don't have an API or automation for that yet. So you might also need to keep it off the firewall if your organization has any strict standards or policies that dictate where the CA may be stored. So you may be under a certain standard or guidelines that you have to follow, for either your company or state, local government, federal government, that kind of thing. I'm not sure if there are any out there. It's just something that I've thought there could conceivably be some either legal or corporate policy that you need to follow for that kind of security. But ultimately, it's up to you. Decide where you want to do it, where it makes sense for you and your network. Odds are, for the typical pfSense user, managing them on pfSense is going to be the way to go. So let's take a look at the certificate manager. That's just located under System and Certificate Manager, which is right here. And that'll take you over here, and there's the CA's tab, Certificates and Certificate Revocation. In the certificate manager, you can create or import a CA or certificate or CRL entries. You can, in 2.4, you can sign certificate signing requests. You can handle intermediate CA chains. You can export any, like a CA certificate or CRL entries, even the keys. You can do a P12 archive for a certificate that bundles all that together, the CA and certificate together. You can do entries on the certificate manager, that can be used wherever they're required on pfSense, which I'll talk more about exactly where later. And you can also associate certificates with users for services that use multi-factor authentication. Currently, OpenVPN is the only thing that does that, but you'll see, like, which one did I put that on? Like, I've got here as a user cert for me, and if I go into the user manager under me, it has it listed as a user certificate there. So the user and the certificate are tied together. All right, so talking about certificate authorities here. So you'll have the columns here across the top on the CA's tab. Descriptive name is just a local name you've given to it. Internal just basically means whether or not you've got the private key for the CA on there. Issuer will show you if it's external or self-signed, or if it's something on there, it will actually show you that it was signed by that. So, like in this case, self-signed means it was a CA that I generated on this firewall for use by this firewall. External means it's a CA that was imported. It was issued by somebody, we don't exactly know who, but it wasn't self-signed, and we don't have a key because so it's not internal. Now, if you come over here and look at this CA list, you'll see I've got a certificate chain going on here. So there's my root, which is self-signed, and an intermediate, which was issued by the root. So we've also got a certificate count for how many certificates are on there. I've got a distinguished name column here that actually has the subject, which is all your identifying information. And it also has the valid from and valid until dates. So the valid from is when it was created or set to be valid as the start time. Valid until is, that's when it will expire. All right. Your in use shows you if that CA is selected for use somewhere, although it's not a perfect measure because some places will implicitly derive if a CA is needed based on the certificate it uses. So it's not a perfect judge, but if it knows it's in use, it'll show you it's in use. And then your actions column, you've got the pencil to edit, you've got the seal, which will export the CA. If you have a private key locally, the key will export the key. And you've got a trash can that if something is not in use, you can delete it. And obviously you hit plus to add a new entry. So first up, importing. If you created a CA somewhere else and you're importing it here, like say you have an OpenVPN site-to-site structure using SSL TLS and you've exported a CA from another system, you give it a descriptive name, set the method to import, and you can paste in the certificate data here. Now, let me see. I don't know if I have any locally here. Let me grab a certificate off something. Let's go here and export something. Let's see if I can. Open. Trying to get it to show me a certificate here. It's just being a little bit of a pain. Anyhow, let that go and see if it pops up here in a minute. So when you're importing, you'll just have your certificate data, which is the block that says, begin certificate data and certificate data with the stuff in between. You can paste that in there. That's really the only thing you have to do. Now, if it's an internal CA that you want to generate new certificates with or assign a CRL with, you need to paste in the private key. If it's an external one, you don't have to do that. Now, if it's an internal certificate authority and you are looking to create new certificates from it, you need to fill in a serial, and it has to be a serial number that is higher than any other certificate that's out there already. So there's what the begin and end certificate block looks like for that one. So the serial number, every certificate has a serial number, and I'll show you what that looks like here. If you're managing your certificates on pfSense, it's just going to be a number, like, if the first one's 1, the second one's 2, and so on and so forth. So if you've got 20 certificates that were made with CA, the next serial number is going to be like 22. So that's easy enough to figure out. Now, if you have some others that are generated, like this one up here is from Let's Encrypt, so it's got a wonky serial number. And these others are just like 1, 2, and 3. So it's easy to figure out if you managed it on pfSense. It may already be in there. Or it's easy to figure out if you're importing from something a lot older, like EasyRSA. It keeps its own serial file that you can check. It's not something that can be stored in the CA. Because the CA itself never changes. It's just the serial count, and we use a number, but it doesn't have to be a number. It can be, or it doesn't have to be like 1, 2, 3. It can be a bunch of different things. So Just has to uniquely identify that certificate. Now in our GUI we use numbers, so just got to put a number in. So if you're just guesstimating, no, oh, there were 20 certificates made, you might even put a serial number of 50 or something, so you've got a lot of leeway. So you need to avoid a serial collision because certificates get revoked internally by serial number, and if you have a collision, you might end up revoking 2 people's certificates when you only meant to revoke 1. So you got to be on the lookout for that. And again, if it's an external CA, you're not looking to do anything like that. You just need to have the CA present because you're using it like for a server certificate or something, or a client certificate. Then all you need to paste in is the certificate data. Now, if we're creating an internal certificate authority, there's a few other things you have to consider here. The key length, 2048, I wouldn't go any less than that. It determines the strength of the private key. 2048 is a good default. I wouldn't go less than that unless you have a legacy device that absolutely can't deal with a key that big. Same with digest algorithm. It should be at least SHA-256 unless there's a legacy requirement. There are some phone handsets out there that may still only deal with SHA-1, like SNOM or Yealink phones that do OpenVPN, but they only deal with SHA-1. Lifetime is how long the CA will be valid. Usually with internal stuff, we just set it to 10 years. Obviously, you can set whatever limit you want, but bear in mind that when that's up, you're going to have to reissue everything. So the remaining fields here identify your location or identify your organization in some way. So you've got state, city, organization unit, and email address. Now the common name with the CA is typically not a host name. It's usually an internal name like internal CA or VPN CA, something like that. Don't put spaces in this. Well, technically you can. Some software does not handle it very well if there's a space in the CN. Same with other certificates. A certificate like a server certificate, don't put a space in there. Now, if you're doing an intermediate certificate authority, it's identical, except you can pick the root CA, which will sign this CA. And obviously, in either case, you need to give it a name. Easy peasy. Working with certificates, very similar. Your list here shows you the name of the certificate. It's also got a little indicator if it's a certificate authority or a server. Generally speaking, if you see anything that says CA yes here, it's probably a mistake. That's why we put it there. Somebody either imported the CA certificate to the wrong place, or they have accidentally made a CA when they meant to make a server or user certificate. A long time ago, the CA flag was set to yes on certificates made for other things by pfSense. Like I'm talking years and years ago, which we fixed that a long time ago. But if you see one that says CA yes, you probably want to replace it with a new properly made certificate. You got your issuer that shows you the CA if it's known, if it's local. Distinguished name, again, it's your identity along with your common name, everything else. You can click the I here for some more detailed information. So like here, we've got VPN server. It shows you the serial number, the digest. It's got an IP address. It's a subject alternative name and a DNS name. Key usage and extended key usage flags. Key usage is going to be pretty common between everything. Extended key usage is going to vary between your user certs and everything else. Like this is TLS web server authentication and IP security IKE intermediate. The IP security IKE intermediate property is needed for IKE v2. And we add it to any certificate that you've marked a server or that you want to be a server. In use works just like the other one, and actions is almost all the same. Certificate exports a certificate, you got a key, and you got an extra box for a P12. And you hit plus to add a new. Importing works just like certificate authorities, except you have to put in a private key. So you have your certificate data, certificate private key, and you got your descriptive name, obviously. Creating internal. It's going to carry over a lot of this information. You do have to put in a new descriptive name, but a lot of this works exactly like either creating a CA or an intermediate CA. You pick your CA, it's going to sign it, and you pick out your key length and digest and identify yourself. Common name in this case generally is either a username or a host name. If it's a And then down here you have additional attributes you can pick as user certificate for users, server certificate for servers. Alternative names, you have a choice here of FQD, a fully qualified domain name or host name, IP address, an email address, or a URI. Generally speaking, this is going to almost always be host names, but you could drop in an IP address in some cases, or an email address if you want to. And you can add multiple of those. So in addition to uh, uh, whatever else you want to do here, I mean, your default values of these are going to carry over. You can always override that and put in something different. There's not really a whole lot to be concerned with there. Now, it will automatically take your common name and stuff it in as the first alternative name when you're doing this. So that makes it a lot easier. You don't have to repeat that. Actually, if you do repeat it, it will make sure it only goes in there once. So the next up thing we're going to talk about is signing requests. So rather than creating and signing in one go, which is what that create an internal does, you can work with a request. And typically how that goes, sort of like what I said before, your client will create a CSR and a private key. The CSR is separate. So the private key stays where it was generated. That CSR gets sent off to the CA. So never send the private key out because it's private. CA will validate your identity, assign your CSR, set some other properties, and send that back. Then the client will take that certificate that it got sent back from the CA, combine that with the private key, and that's how you get used. You know, you may have to have your whole chain of CA and intermediate certificates along there, but pretty straightforward. Now the interface to create a CSR is almost identical to creating a certificate. You don't have a CA choice because you're not submitting it to a CA directly from here. Now, you do have these choices down here for your certificate type and alternative names, but you need to remember with the CSR, those are only a suggestion. Those may not get carried through. The CA by default can't carry those through. At least, especially in our case, if you're signing in the pfSense GUI, those you can't automatically bring those over. And the CA can really set whatever it wants there. It can completely ignore any properties you've set and set its own. So once you create a CSR, it's going to show up in the GUI like here. It'll say external signature pending. You can hit this little export with the arrow there, and it'll export the CSR, and that's what you send off. You get it back, you hit this pencil, paste in your final certificate, and it will promote this entry up to a full CSR. Alternately, you can sign the CSR directly in the GUI. If say you are pasting, or somebody gave you a CSR in another box you want to sign with the CA on pfSense, or you made a CSR on pfSense, you want to sign it there too. You can do that. Just enter in your name, you pick your CA to sign it with. If it's a new CSR, you can paste the CSR data here. If you paste in the key data, you can save that locally as a full certificate for use. Or you can just put the CSR in, and it'll export. It'll let you get the certificate without the key. Or you can pick any CSR will show up in the list you can pick to sign it. Now here, because you're the CA, you get to choose what goes in this. You can tell it what kind of type it is, put in whatever alternative names you want. In this case, you do need to make sure you know what the CN is and stuff it in here for most uses. But that's, again, up to you. Just drop the username in there if you know it, or a host name. Hit save, and it'll do all the work, and it'll show it like here, the signed CSR, it'll show it there. So we also have certificate revocation lists over here. And again, this is how users will determine if, or even a server will determine if a certificate is valid. The most common use on pfSense you'll see this for is OpenVPN. Say you need to, if somebody's laptop got stolen, phone got lost, whatever, you can revoke the certificate, and then the server will not accept that certificate anymore. So in your list here, it's got some similar columns like before. It's over here on the certificate revocation tab. It's got your name of the CRL, whether or not it's internal, how many certificates are revoked, if it's in use or not. I think I've got one over here. And it has a listing here for every CA, even though you may not be able to actually make one for everyone. So because you can't necessarily create a CA internally for these, but if it's external, you could import a CRL, which is where that would come in. If you need to have a private key for the CA present in order to create a new CRL, but you don't have to have that if you just want to import. But you can't add to an imported copy. So if you're looking to import, just pick import, and you can paste in CRL data. That's it. That's all you can do. If you're creating a new one, to start with, you just give it a name and pick the CA it's associated with, enter a lifetime and serial number for it. Now, I don't have anything on this one. If I can edit this, it'll say there's no certificates on it, and I can pick a certificate that's on there and tell it I don't want that one anymore. I can tell it you could pick a reason here. There's a number of reasons here. If you don't know, you can just leave it at no status or unspecified, key compromise, whatever. Say key compromise. Now, if I go back in here, it shows up in the list. And you have to have the certificate present on the firewall to revoke it at the moment. It stores a copy of the revoked certificate on the CRL, so you can manage this list later. Otherwise, it would only be possible to add to it. But I think the way the CRL generation happens in OpenSSL, there may be a restriction of the PHP module. We have to keep everything around. Once you have revoked the certificate, you could remove it from the certificates tab if you want, but I would always keep a copy of it somewhere in case you need to revoke it or make a new CRL later. All right, so how to use these things? Well, in pfSense and packages, there's a lot of places, pretty much anywhere that's going to want to use a certificate is going to pull their certificates from our manager. So in the base, you've got HTTPS for the web GUI that's going to pull it. You have OpenVPN, SSL TLS is going to have a choice for CA and certificate. IPsec if you're using IKV2 or mutual RSA type. Captive portal if you're running an HTTPS portal, that'll have a spot for it. In packages, you've got HA proxy, FreeRadius will use it for EAP, Squid will use it for peek and splicer, or especially for man in the middle, like Bump, or even for its reverse proxy. We also have Net SNMP. I think there's probably a couple I'm forgetting, but any of those places you want to use a certificate, you're going to either be creating it or importing it into the certificate manager. When you can create certificates on pfSense and export them elsewhere, as long as what you're using trusts the root, then you can do that. Now, in terms of OpenVPN, there's an OpenVPN wizard that will step you through creating the CA and certificate for you. Makes it a little bit easier. It pre-fills some of the properties and stuff you need to run the VPN, which is pretty slick. And then we have our OpenVPN client export package, which bundles everything back together and gives you the configuration you can just hand to a user, which makes it dealing with certificates much easier. So just a few clicks and you can have a VPN up, and you don't have to worry about all of the nuts and bolts of the certificate stuff. You would have to manually create a user certificate in that case. So also remember, with external devices and software, the target has to trust the CA. So if it's OpenVPN, that's pretty easy. The CA is usually in a file referenced right next to the other certificates. Really simple. For IPsec or Squid, man in the middle stuff, you're going to be importing the CA and trusting it in the client operating system or related software. It could be a VPN client, could be the operating system, like Windows, Mac, whatever, or you may have imported in Firefox. Or StrongSwan client, that kind of stuff. I've gone into detail on how to do all of that in all these previous Hangouts we've done. I've kind of touched on little bits of certificate stuff here and there, but I haven't done anything this in-depth. So if you really need information specific to one area of pfSense, go back and look at that. Specifically, if you want to know about importing it into the client, you're going to want to look at either the remote access VPN Hangout or the Squid Hangout. The last one I did a couple of months back, and it go into a lot more detail there. So if you're looking for the GUI and other HTTPS server usages not by a browser, you might look at the Acme package. There was another Hangout on that a couple of months back, and that will actually get you a free trusted certificate that you can use. So all you have to do is set up the automation to validate it, usually something DNS based or based on the web server. HA proxy integrates really easily with that. One thing I kind of skipped over, I didn't show you. In the user manager, there's another way to make a certificate. So if you come here and if you make a new user, I don't have a GMP user on this one, so let's make GMP. And if you have a CA locally here that you can use to create a certificate, it will offer you the option here to make a new certificate. Then I can just type in GMP again for the description, make sure I'm on the right certificate authority, pick my key length, bam. So in one go, it's made the user and associated the certificate with it. And if I go into the certificate manager, it shows my user, my certificate there, and that it's a user cert. So really easy. You can take an existing user and associate a certificate with it. If I take this guy here, I can add a user certificate, and it gives me a similar interface here. I can choose an existing certificate or create a new one right here. If I create internal, it's going to pre-fill the user's name, the username there, and descriptive name, and you can put it again in common name. But if you choose an existing certificate, it just lets you pick it from a list. So I'll take this one here. And now it shows it, because I have it on a CRL, it shows it as revoked. Now something else about CRLs too. Oh, by the way, if you have any questions, go ahead and start typing them now. But I'll keep talking a little bit more while you're typing up questions, because I'm going to have to, I've got about 5 more minutes left here. So if you have a CRL, you can have, say you've got 3 OpenVPN servers, you could have 3 different CRLs, and you could have different certificates in each CRL, which is kind of weird, but it's possible. I've seen people do it. So you can have like, a CRL, say you don't want one person to connect to one VPN. There's a couple different ways to accomplish that, but you could revoke the certificate, put it on one CRL, and then put that CRL on a specific VPN you don't want that user to hit. And then, or, like I said, there's other ways to accomplish that, probably better than that, but might check that out. All right, so any other questions? Anything at all? So create a user certificate for users that are linked via auth servers like LDAP. You just make a user certificate. It will not show it to you as, it will not say it's a user certificate, but you just go into the certificate manager on the certificates tab and just create an internal certificate. It just makes sure it's marked a user certificate here. And then just put the username and the common name, and that's all you have to do special. So how do I limit a cert to one user? That is really up to the actual software. Now OpenVPN has an option for that, others don't. But like if you go to OpenVPN, oops, I've got one here. OpenVPN has an option to do strict user CN matching. And when you have that enforced match set, then the username that they logged in with the username and password has to match the common name on the certificate. So that's how you would restrict that one cert to that one user. And yeah, ideally you would have a separate certificate for every user or device. But if you have to reuse them on OpenVPN, you can, if you check the duplicate connection box here. It's better to have a separate certificate for everything if you can, even a separate user ID, because say you lose your phone or your phone gets stolen, whatever, if you share that certificate everywhere, you're going to have to get a new certificate and then put it back on your phone, your laptop, your work computer, whatever. So it's really just about limiting your exposure, and it's better security to have a unique certificate for everybody. All right, so I got maybe one more question here. Actually, I need to wrap it up. I think that may be enough for today anyhow. So thank everybody for attending. We'll see you back here next month. Bye-bye.